They were walking along on the way to Jerusalem, and Jesus was teaching them. It seems whenever they were walking, Jesus was teaching. He has so much to say, and by this point in his ministry, little time to say it. Now, I can imagine these disciples huddled around him in a semicircle, walking as quietly as they can, their heads bowed and their ears tilted in to hear every word he has to say. And then he stops. And he says something to them he had just said a few days earlier. He says, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after he's killed, he will rise again. There's an awkward silence from the disciples. They don't say a word, at least not to Jesus. Because they remember just a few days ago when he had said this very same thing, Peter got a little cocky. Peter thought he knew what he was talking about, and so Jesus chewed him out in public. Get behind me, Satan, Jesus said. No one's going to risk that this time. But as the journey continues, I can imagine that there's a little bit of whispering now among the disciples. What do you think he's talking about? One of them says. Who is this Son of Man character? Is he talking about himself? I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. I'm not going to ask after what happened to Peter a couple days ago. They keep their questions and their reactions to themselves because they don't understand. Usually Jesus is a pretty good teacher, isn't he? He uses object lessons. He tells stories. He uses images from everyday life so his listeners can understand what he's saying. But this time, it seems, he's not getting the job done. This is the second time he said the very same thing the very same way. They didn't understand it the first time, and they don't understand it the second. Now, I know some of you are educators. And you know one of the cardinal rules of teaching is to explain something as many different ways as possible. Use pictures, use words, use object lessons. Because we know that all students learn in different ways. They have what we call different learning styles. And so we want to say something as many different ways as possible, or show it, or get the kids in the class to act it out. Anything that will help them to understand and to get it. Jesus says the very same thing, the very same way. The disciples didn't get it the first time, and they still don't. But I wonder, is it really Jesus' fault that they don't get it? As the journey continues, the conversation among the disciples begins to take a different turn. Maybe one of them says, now that I think about it, I actually understand what he's talking about more often than not. And I know I understand more often than the rest of you bozos. Now wait a minute. You think just because you were the first one to join this group and have been here the longest that you're some kind of saint? Because if I recall, most of the time he's trying to explain something, you're fast asleep. Another one chimes in, I think both of you have got it wrong. Remember a couple weeks ago when he sent us out to cast out demons? Y'all couldn't do anything, at least I cast out a couple. And more people joined the mission because of my testimony than because of yours. And on and on and on, like children, arguing about who mama loves the best. Bickering, pettiness, and rivalry among the disciples. But we shouldn't really be surprised the disciples act this way. I mean, where in our own culture are we not encouraged to prove that we're the best, to get ahead, to climb up the ladder, to show in what area of life we are the greatest? We do the same thing. I started playing in the band when I was in the 6th grade, and I played all the way through my senior year in high school. And if you've been in band, you know that every year at the beginning of band, you have a competition to see who's going to be the first chair or the second chair or the third chair of every instrument on down the line. And from 6th grade all the way through high school, Sarah Peters and I, who's now a very rich doctor in Ohio, Sarah Peters and I were always first and second chair alto saxophone or second and first chair alto saxophone, back and forth, year after year. And if you were the second chair saxophone and you thought maybe that you'd practiced enough that you could beat the first chair, then we could challenge the other to a kind of musical duel to prove finally, once and for all, we hoped, who was the greatest. We start learning early, don't we? The disciples, the Bible said, argued about who among them was the greatest. If any of you ever have the blessing to go to as many pastors' meetings as Ginger and I do, some of you will, you will hear inevitably conversations that sound like this. So, how many are you worshiping these days? How many are you worshiping? That's a technical term. It's a term of art. It means, what is your average worship attendance on Sunday morning these days? Oh, we're worshiping 250. That's up 20% from 2 years ago. Oh, that's great. You know, we're so excited. We added 20 families to the rolls just 2 years ago. Oh, congratulations. And then another one might say, we have 40 kids in confirmation this year. That's 10 more than we had last year. It's very subtle. Okay, it's not so subtle. We just do what everyone else does, right? We're looking over our shoulder, wondering who's the best, seeing where we stack up. I have just a little confession to make. One of my favorite magazines is called The Christian Century. I've had a subscription for about 10 years now, and in that 10 years, I have written for this magazine 2 times. But I have a number of friends and colleagues who also like to write for this magazine. And it used to be, I don't do it so much anymore, but it used to be that when my magazine would come to my mailbox, I would rush out to get it, because it came every 2 weeks, so I knew when it was coming. I'd rush out to get it, and I'd open to the table of contents, and the first thing I would do is not look at the title of the articles to see what I wanted to read about, but I would see who wrote the articles, to see which of my friends and colleagues was publishing more than me, which ones were passing me up. And when I saw their names, instead of being excited for them and eager to read what they'd written, I'd more likely feel sorry for myself. The disciples are only doing what every one of us in this room have done probably more often than we should. Compare ourselves to one another, I suppose, in order to prove to ourselves that we matter, in order to reassure our ever-trembling egos that we're important, because we're better at least than one other person. What were you arguing about on the way? Jesus asked the disciples. Again, an awkward silence. Not because they don't understand, but because they know he wouldn't approve. There's something I need to tell you, he says. Who is the greatest is not what matters in God's eyes. It's not what matters in the culture of God's kingdom, even though that's what matters to y'all right now. What matters is who is a servant. It doesn't matter who can climb up the ladder. What matters is who's willing to climb down. Whoever wants to be first among you must be last of all and servant of all, Jesus says. And that's the reason the disciples didn't get it. That's the reason they couldn't understand. When we disciples are so concerned with our own self-importance, And when that obsession with our own self-importance leads to a life of comparison and competition, then we simply can't understand when Jesus says something like, I'm going to suffer and die and rise again. How can we possibly understand when Jesus says something so countercultural like, I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many? It simply doesn't compute. The disciples were blinded by their own concern for themselves. So blinded that they couldn't see the countercultural way of God's kingdom of servanthood. And it's no different for us. Narrowly focused on our own concerns, we too will be blinded to the way of Jesus. In the middle of August, I was trying unsuccessfully to get back to the Raleigh-Durham airport from O'Hare in Chicago. I had a 7 o'clock flight on a Sunday evening, and then it was delayed, and then it was delayed again, and I could see the airplane out the window. It was tantalizingly close. They assured us that in just a few minutes, the part to fix the instrument would show up and we would be on our way, and then it was delayed again, and finally the plane was canceled. And 200 tired and angry people made a mad rush to the customer service desk so we could get rerouted and somehow, someday, get back to the Raleigh-Durham airport. I managed to be put on an airplane the next day flying into Greensboro, which was close enough. By 11:30, I had my hotel voucher, along with about 60 other people staying in the same hotel, and made my way out to the place where the hotel shuttle would show up. The bus came, and I was in the front of the line, so I quickly ran to the trunk of the shuttle in order to put my bags in the trunk so I could get on the shuttle. But while about 6 or 8 of us were trying to get our luggage in the trunk of the bus, everyone else with their luggage in their hands was pouring into the bus. And so the bus filled up, and we couldn't get on, so we went back and got our luggage out of the trunk and waited a half an hour for the next shuttle. The next shuttle came. This time we had a plan. More people had gotten in line with us, and we thought to ourselves, we're just going to let them put their luggage on the trunk. And because they don't know better, while they're putting their luggage on the trunk, we're going to get on the bus with our luggage in our laps. And so the bus driver got off, a different bus driver this time. He got off and he opened the trunk, and we stood there waiting to rush onto the bus. But the door didn't open. And the door didn't open. And more people loaded their luggage onto the trunk, and the door didn't open. And then the bus driver walked to the door, opened it, and said, now whoever has their luggage in the trunk can get on the bus. And we stood there and watched them all file on board and watched the bus drive away. We had learned our lesson. Pay attention to who's driving the bus. And since then, I've been wondering, in this battle to be first on the bus, if Jesus had been there, where would he have been in this? And then it occurred to me, it doesn't really matter where he would have been, because we wouldn't have seen him anyway. Whether he was simply standing in the back, letting everyone else on board, or whether he was helping the elderly onto the bus or helping folks get their luggage into the trunk, not worrying about his place on the bus. It doesn't matter where he would have been, because so blinded by our efforts to secure our place on the bus, to get our seat, we wouldn't have been able to see the way of Jesus right there in front of us. I have a favorite prayer that we have prayed on Sunday mornings before, and we've given it about a year ago to chairs of all of the committees in the church in case they want to use it as a prayer to open a committee. And it says this. It says, cause our congregation to be an effective witness to your love and power. And then, to this end, banish from us pettiness and rivalry, speaking ill of one another, seeking to serve ourselves rather than you. In other words, Lord, help us. Help us to be a church that gets it, a church that understands. Help us to be disciples who don't worry about who's best and who's most important and who's getting on the bus first. Help us be disciples who are willing to live your way of downward mobility, your life of service. Lord, in a culture so characterized by competition and comparison, help us in our life together to show the world, to exhibit to the world, to witness in the world to your alternative way. The disciples didn't get it, not because Jesus was a bad teacher, but because they were blinded by their own self-concern. As it turns out, fortunately for us, Jesus was a good teacher. He wasn't content simply to tell us what a life of servanthood looks like. He wasn't even content to illustrate such a life with little stories like the story of the Good Samaritan. No, he gave us the perfect object lesson. He did it. He lived it. In his own flesh and blood, he showed us what living in this countercultural kingdom of servanthood looks like. He risked being rejected. He risked suffering death. He became the last. He became the least of these, abandoned on a cross for us. But in becoming last, he also became first. The first for God to raise from the dead, never to die again. Whoever wants to be first of all must be last of all and servant of all. Jesus' own life and death and resurrection has made that kind of servanthood possible even for us. Thanks be to God. Amen.